The maul came down, and the rotted plank gave way with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. And Tabitha did not move. She knelt in the wet sand of the riverbank with the tools still in her two hands, looking down into the broken belly of the little boat she had bought for $2. And she said nothing. The water at the river edge went on its slow brown errand behind her. A heron lifted off the far mudflat. For the length of an hour, by the church bell that marked the quarters across the water, she crouched there and spoke no word to anyone, and the men who had laughed at her, purchased 3 days before, stopped laughing, because there is a kind of silence that tells a town. She was 29 years old that autumn, and she had come to the river landing called Stillwell Crossing with one trunk, a chest of caulking tools, and the trade her grandfather had taught her with his own ruined hands. The Caddo River ran wide and silt-heavy past the town, carrying flatboats down to the cotton wharves and bringing the mail packet up twice a week, and the whole of the place lived off the water the way a tick lives off a dog, gratefully and without thanks. There was a chandlery, a freight office, a boarding house with a sagging gallery, and a long muddy strand where boats came to die. Tabitha had taken a room at the boarding house and hung out no sign, because a woman who mends boats does not need a sign in a town that small. Word of her arrival traveled before she had unpacked the trunk. Her grandfather had been a boatwright on the Ohio waters before the war, and then on the lower rivers after it. And he had taught her to read a hull the way another man reads a face. He had been dead 2 years. She still heard him in her hands more than in her ears, but when she needed his voice, she could call it up plain. A boat does not lie to you, he had told her. More than once his thumb pressed into a soft place in a gunwale where the rot had got in. It cannot. It only tells you the truth slow, and you have to be willing to sit with it. She had been willing to sit with a great many things in her life, and most of them had not been worth the sitting. She did not yet know that this one would be. The skiff had been pulled up on the strand for the better part of a year, half sunk in the shallows where the spring rise had left it, and nobody wanted it. It was a plain double-ender, maybe 14 feet, the kind a man builds for himself out of cypress to run a trot line or carry a sack of corn across to the mill. The river had been into it and out of it through a whole turn of seasons. The thwarts were green with slime. The paint, what was left of it, had gone the color of old tea. When the freight agent put up the few derelict craft for sale to clear the strand, the skiff was the last lot, and the auctioneer made a joke of it, asking who would give $1 for a thing that had already chosen the bottom. Tabitha gave $2. She raised her hand and said the number once in a voice that carried no farther than it needed to, and the men along the strand turned to look at her, and one of them, a big freight hand named Pell, laughed and said she had bought herself a great deal of river to bail. Another said she would own a fine hole to keep her fish in. The auctioneer, a thin, careful man named Wick, who handled the freight office books, asked her twice if she was certain, the way a man asks who would rather not take a woman's $2 for a thing that would shame him to sell. She was certain. She paid in coin and signed the strand-clearing book in a clean, upright hand, and the men went back to their work, and the joke followed her up the bank and into the boarding house and around the town for 3 days, the way a small joke will in a place with little else to chew. What she had seen that none of them had bothered to see was the line of the keel. A boat that has merely rotted sags. It loses its shape the way a dead thing loses its shape, settling toward the ground in every direction at once. This skiff did not sag. Under all the slime and the ruin, the keel ran dead straight, the planks held their curve, and the stem stood up out of the water, at the angle a good builder gives it. Somebody had built the little boat well, built it to last a lifetime of crossings, and then it had gone to the bottom anyway, long before its time, with all that good work still in it. That was the thing that would not let her alone. A well-built boat does not sink in calm water for no reason. Her grandfather had taught her that too. When a sound hoe goes down, she had heard him say, "Somebody put it there," and the river keeps the secret until a body comes asking. She came asking. The morning after the auction, she walked down to the strand at first light, before the town was awake, and she waded into the shallows in an old pair of her own boots and ran her hands over the hull below the waterline, reading it with her fingers in the cold, the way her grandfather had taught her to read in the dark. The cypress was sound, the fastenings were iron, not the cheap-cut nails a careless man uses, but clinched nails set by somebody who meant the joints to hold. She found the hole that had sunk it low on the port side aft, a single clean breach the size of her fist, and when she got her fingers into it, she felt the splintered ends pointing inward, not out. The boat had not struck a snag and torn itself open. Something had been driven through the hull from the outside, hard, on purpose, by a hand that wanted it on the bottom and wanted it to stay. She sat back on her heels in the river and let the cold work up her arms, and thought about that for a while. Above her, the bell across the water struck 6, and a dog began to bark somewhere up in the town, and the first smoke rose from the boarding-house chimney. A boat does not lie to you. This one had begun, in its slow way, to tell her the truth, and she found that she wanted very much to hear the rest of it. There was an old woman in the town who took in washing, a stooped black woman named Effie, who lived in a one-room cabin behind the chandlery, and had been at the landing longer than anyone could remember. Tabitha had carried water for her twice in the first week, not out of design, but because the woman's well rope had frayed, and a young pair of hands was a young pair of hands. On the third day, with the skiff still half in the river and the town still laughing, Tabitha sat on Effie's step in the evening and asked her plainly whose boat it had been. The old woman did not answer for a moment. She wrung a shirt out over the basin and hung it dripping on the line, and the water ran down off the cuff and beat a slow rhythm into the dust, and only then did she speak. "That was Amos Dell's boat," she said. "He built it this summer. His wife was carrying there first. Built it down on the strand with his own hands, every board of it. And he used to take it across to the church on the far bank on a Sunday, with his wife sitting in the stern under a parasol like the queen of the river. Then one fall the boat came up empty, drifting, and Amos was gone off the face of the earth, and the freight office said he had run from his debts and taken a packet down river in the night and left the boat to drift. Effie's hands had gone still on the line. He did not run, she said. I knew that man. He did not run. Tabitha asked what the town had decided, since the town always decides. The freight agent in those days had been a man named Orrin Quill, a smooth, heavy man who held the paper on half the small claims along that stretch of river, and Quill had produced a note in Amos Dell's name, a debt of some hundreds of dollars against the man's land and his boat and his future. Quill had called the note and taken the 40 acres of bottom land the Dells had cleared and the cabin, and turned the widow and her newborn off it before the first snow. The widow had died within the year. The child had been raised by the church and was a grown man, now gone west to the railroad camps, and the 40 acres had passed from Quill to a land company, and from the land company to a cotton planter, and were planted in cotton to this day. Orrin Quill himself had grown rich and old and respectable, and had died in his bed 11 years past, mourned by the better sort of the town as a builder of the country. That was the wrong. Tabitha did not know yet what shape the proof of it would take, or whether there was any proof at all left in the world. She only knew that a sound boat had been driven to the bottom by a deliberate hand, and that a good man had gone off the face of the earth the same season, and that a heavy man had grown rich on the timing of it. She thanked Effie for the telling and walked back up to the boarding house in the dark, and she did not sleep much. And in the morning she went down to the strand and began to bring the boat up out of the river. It was not quick work, and she did not hurry it. She had no help and wanted none. She rigged a line from the skiff to a dead man. She sank in the bank, a buried log with the rope round it, and she hauled the boat a hand's width at a time up the slope of the strand, with a lever and a roller, the way one woman moves a thing built for the strength of 3 men, by patience and by purchase. It took her the better part of 2 days to get the skiff clear of the water and turned over on a bed of cut poles where she could work it. Her hands blistered and the blisters broke, and she bound them with strips of an old shirt and went on. The men on the strand watched her do it and said less than they had said before. There is a thing that happens when a town watches a person work who will not stop, and it is not quite respect yet, but it is the ground that respect grows out of. With the boat up and drained, she could see it whole for the first time, and what she saw deepened the puzzle rather than solving it. The hull was a single skin of cypress plank over sawn frames, as a skiff that size ought to be, and there was nothing hidden in the open belly of it. No false locker under a thwart, no cash lashed up under the gunwale. Whatever the boat had to tell her was in the boat itself, in the wood, and she would have to take the wood apart to hear it. She spent a day doing nothing but looking, running a tallow candle along the inside of the planking in the dim of the early morning, watching for the place where the grain of the story changed. She found it low in the bottom, aft, near the breach that had sunk her. The garboard plank, the long bottom plank that runs nearest the keel, was not 1 plank, but 2, scarfed together end to end with a long tapered joint, and the joint had been fared so smooth and paid so carefully with pitch that a careless eye would never have caught it. There was no reason for a builder to scarf a garboard in a boat that size. Cypress came in lengths long enough to run the bottom hole. A man only joins a plank where he must, and there was no must here, unless the joint was not a joint at all, but a door. The bottom of the boat was thicker than it had any cause to be. Somewhere in that thickness, between the plank a man would step on and the plank the river touched, there was a space. And a man had built the space on purpose and hidden the building of it. And Tabitha sat back on her heels in the gray light and understood that she was not looking at a boat anymore. She was looking at a strong box shaped like a boat. Her grandfather had built such things. He had told her about them on winter nights, the false bottoms and the hollow thwarts that rivermen used to run gold past the gunboats in the war, and to carry a season's takings safe from the men who watched the wharves. The trick of it, he had said, was that a hiding place fails the moment somebody thinks to look for one, so the cunning man does not hide a box. He hides the fact that there is anything to hide. He builds the boat around the secret, so the secret is the boat, and then he goes about his business in plain sight, and no man searches a thing that is exactly what it appears to be. She had thought, when he told her that it was a fine old river yarn. She had not thought she would one day kneel over the proof of it with her own tools in her hands. She did not split the bottom that day, though she wanted to. She had learned patience the hard way, and she knew that whatever was sealed in the wood had been sealed against the river for years, and that if she opened it carelessly, she might destroy the very thing the wood had kept. And so she went up into the town instead, and she did a thing that surprised the people who had laughed at her. She went to the freight office, and she asked the careful thin man named Wick, who kept the books now where Orr and Quill had kept them once, whether the old records of the landing still existed, the strand-clearing books and the freight ledgers and the notes of debt from the years before the railroad. Wick looked at her a long moment over his spectacles. "The old books were in the loft," he said. "Water-stained and chewed by mice. Of no use to anybody, and she was welcome to them. If she could stand the dust." The loft of the freight office was a low place under the roof shakes, reached by a ladder behind the counter, and the heat of the day collected up there and stayed into the night, and the air was thick with the smell of mouse and mildew and old tallow. The ledgers were stacked in a corner under a torn tarpaulin. A dozen heavy books, bound in cracked leather, their spines gone to powder where the damp had got at them. Tabitha set her lantern on an upturned crate and took the books down, one at a time, and opened them across her knees, and the pages were brown at the edges and soft as cloth, and some of them had been chewed to lace by the mice along the lower margins. She turned them with care, a page at a time, and she did not let the heat hurry her. She spent 3 evenings that way, after the day's light was gone and the town had quieted, and she was not looking for the debt note, which she was sure was a forgery and which a forger would have made to look correct. She was looking for the boat. A boat that crossed to the far bank every Sunday. A boat used by a man with land and a wife and standing, would appear in the river records in the ferry counts and the landing fees and the toll a man paid to tie up at the public strand. She found Amos Dell's name a dozen times across 4 years, paying his nickel to land, paying his fee to the church ferry, his hand always the same plain hand. She found the last entry. And then she found the thing she had not known to look for, the thing that made her sit very still in the loft with the lantern hissing beside her. In the freight ledger, in Orrin Quill's own heavy, careful hand, 3 days after Amos Dell was said to have run down river in the night to escape his debts, there was an entry crediting the account of the steam packet that ran south for the passage of one man paid by Orrin Quill. Quill had paid for the passage. The story the town believed, that Amos Dell had fled in the night to escape Quill's note, rested on Amos Dell taking a packet downriver. And here in Quill's own ledger was the proof that Quill himself had bought that passage and entered it in his own books, because a man who is building a lie likes the lie to be tidy, and a tidy lie wants a paid fare to point to. A man fleeing his creditor does not have his creditor buy his ticket. The entry was not evidence of Amos Dell leaving. It was evidence of Orrin Quill needing the town to believe he had. Tabitha copied the entry out by lantern light, the date and the sum and the words, exactly as Quill had written them, and she climbed down out of the loft with the dust thick in her throat and a cold certainty settling into her chest that she had not had before. Still, a ledger entry was a thread and not a knot. A clever man could explain it a dozen ways. Quill was 11 years dead and could not be made to answer for his own bookkeeping. The thing that would answer, if anything in the world would answer, was sealed in the bottom of the boat, and it was time to open it. She chose the morning for it, early, with the light low across the river, and the town not yet about. She had honed her chisels the night before, until they would part a hair, and she had her grandfather's maul, the head worn smooth on one face by his hand, and then by hers. She set the boat upright on its poles, and she knelt in the wet sand at the stern, and she found with her fingers the upriver end of the long hidden scarf, where the 2 halves of the false bottom came together. She set the chisel into the seam. She did not chop at it. She drove it slow, a tap, and then a pause to listen, the way her grandfather had taught her to open a thing you did not want to break, and the old paid pitch cracked along the joint with a small dry sound, and the seam began to part, and the cold sealed air of years came up out of the wood into her face, river-smelling and stale and old, the breath of a thing that had been shut a long time. She worked the chisel the length of the joint, and she set the maul to the loosened plank, and she split the hull of the $2 skiff along the line a dead man had built into it, and the false bottom came up in her two hands like the lid of a box. That was the hour she went silent. Inside the hollow she had opened, wrapped in a sheet of oiled sailcloth, gone stiff and dark, lay the things a drowned man's killer had wanted to be at the bottom of the river forever. There was a packet of papers, sealed in beeswax against the water and the years, and the wax had held. There was a small daguerreotype in a hinged case, the glass clouded, but the image under it still there. A young man standing stiff and proud beside a seated woman, and the woman held a parasol, and Tabitha knew without being told that she was looking at Amos Dell and his wife on the day they had means enough to sit for a likeness. And there was a thing she had not expected and did not at first understand, a man's brass-case pocket watch. The chain, still through the bow, stopped, its back engraved with letters she could not read through the tarnish. She lifted each thing out and laid it on the dry sailcloth in the sun, and she knelt over them, and the hour began. She did not weep. She was not a weeping woman, and the moment did not call for it. She knelt very still in the sand, with her ruined hands open on her knees, and she let the truth come into her. The slow way, the only way a true thing ever comes. And she did not say a word while it came. The bell across the water struck the quarters one after another, and she did not move for any of them. Pell, the freight hand, came down to the strand and saw her kneeling there over the opened boat and the strange small things laid out in the sun, and he opened his mouth to make some joke, and then shut it again, and went away quiet, and told the others. And one by one, the men of the landing came down to the edge of the strand, and stood at a distance, and did not speak either, because the silence of a person who has found something is a thing that other people feel before they understand it. For an hour, the woman who had bought a hole to keep her fish in knelt over what the hole had been keeping, and the town stood around her and held its tongue, and the river ran by indifferent, as the river always runs. When the hour was done, she rose, stiff in the knees, and she gathered the things back into the oiled cloth with great care, and she carried them up the bank, and she did not show them to anyone yet. She had learned that, too, the hard way. In other towns, a truth shown too soon to the wrong people is a truth that disappeared. She took the packet to the one place in the town she judged safe, the cabin of the old laundress behind the chandlery, and she sat at Effie's table with the lamp lit and the door shut, and she broke the beeswax seal that Amos Dell had pressed with his own thumb the last day of his life. The papers were 3. The first was the true note of debt, the real one, in Amos Dell's plain hand, and it was not for hundreds of dollars, but for 40. A small, honest debt against a seasoned seed, with a line at the bottom in the same hand, recording it paid in full, with the date, the autumn he disappeared. He had paid the debt and kept the receipt of his own paying, and sealed it where no man could reach it. The note Quill had produced to take the land, the note, for hundreds, had been a forgery laid over a debt already settled. The second paper was a deed, the patent to the 40 acres of bottomland, granted to Amos Dell by the land office, and signed and sealed by the government of the United States. The original under the wax. The thing a man must hold to prove the land is his. The thing Quill had needed gone before he could put another deed in its place. Amos Dell had not carried his deed in a strong box in a bank where Quill could reach it. He had carried it in the bottom of his boat, because he did not trust the bank and he did not trust Quill, and he had been right not to. The third paper was a letter, and it was the letter that told Tabitha how the man had died. It was dated the week of his disappearance, and it was addressed to his wife, and it was the letter of a man who knows he is in danger and is setting his affairs in order while he can. Quill had come to him, the letter said, and offered to buy the 40 acres for 1/10 of their worth, and Amos had refused, and Quill had grown cold and said that the river was a chancy place for a man who crossed it alone every Sunday, and Amos had understood the threat in it. He wrote that he had sealed the deed and the receipt where Quill would never find them, in the one place Quill would never think to look, and that if anything should befall him, his wife was to find a true boatwright, a person who knew hulls, and have the boat taken apart. He had not been able to get the letter to her. He had sealed it with the rest and trusted the boat to carry it, and the boat had gone to the bottom with the breach in its side, and the letter had waited at the bottom of the river for the true boatwright the dead man had asked for. And after a great many years she had come and given $2 for the asking. That was the watch. Tabitha understood the watch last, sitting at Effie's table with the lamp burning low. It was not Amos Dell's watch. The letter named it. Yi War had worn a watch on a heavy chain, a watch the whole town knew that he showed off at the freight office, and the night Quill drove the snag through the hull and put the boat down with Amos in it. In the struggle of it, the watch had been torn from Quill's waistcoat and gone into the bottom of the boat with the rest, and Amos, already dying, already going down, had closed his hand on it and held it. A drowning man holds what is given him. He had taken into the boat with him the one thing that named his killer, the engraved watch every soul at the landing would know on sight, and he had carried it down into the dark and kept it for 11 years past the day the killer himself was lowered respected into his grave. Effie took the watch in her old hands and turned it to the lamp and read the worn engraving on the back, the initials, and she said the name aloud, Orrin Quill. And then she set the watch down on the table very gently, as a person sets down something that is too heavy to hold long. The proof was complete, and it had been complete the whole time, sealed in a thing the killer himself had walked past 1,000 times on the strand and never thought to look inside, because the boat was exactly what it appeared to be. Quill had even tried, in his careful way, to be rid of it. Effie remembered now, with the watch in front of her to loosen the memory, that in the year after Amos vanished, Quill had sent men twice to drag the strand and burn the derelicts to clear it, and twice the little half-sunk skiff had been passed over as worthless, too far gone to bother, and Quill had not dared to be seen taking a personal interest in one rotting boat among the many for fear of the very question it would raise. So he had let it lie and trusted the river to finish what the snag had started. The river had not finished it, because Amos Dell had built the boat too well, and the keel had held straight under the slime for all those years. And the thing the killer most needed gone had been kept whole by the dead man's own good work in the very water the killer had used to drown him. Tabitha did not go to the law that night, because the law in that county had buried Orrin Quill with honor and would not thank a strange woman for digging him up. She went instead in the days that followed, the slow, careful way her grandfather would have gone. She wrote to the land office in the territorial capital, enclosing a true copy of the patent number and the date, and asked them to certify from their own records who held the original grant to the 40 acres of bottomland at Stillwell Crossing. She wrote to the bank in the river city downstream where the steam packet ran, asking whether any passenger by the name of Amos Dell had ever in fact disembarked there, or taken a room, or drawn on an account. In the autumn, the town said he had fled. She gathered the answers the way she gathered a boat up a bank, a hand's width at a time, and she did not let any of it slide back. The land office wrote back that the patent to the 40 acres stood in the name of Amos Dell and had never been lawfully conveyed, that no deed of sale bearing his true signature had ever been recorded, and that the transfer to Orrin Quill, 11 years gone, rested on a quitclaim the office now, with the original patent before it, could see had been executed by a hand that was not Dell's. The packet company wrote that no man named Dell had ever come ashore at the southern landing, that autumn or any autumn, though their books showed the fare paid in advance by one Orenquill, a thing their clerk had thought strange at the time and noted in the margin, a stranger paying a stranger's way, and the stranger never coming aboard. The lie had been tidy, and the tidiness was what undid it. A man who had simply let Amos Dell vanish would have left less behind than the man who took such care to explain the vanishing. The grown son came back in the spring. Effie had written to him at the railroad camp where he worked as a grade foreman, and the letter had taken 6 weeks to find him and his answer. 6 weeks to come back, a single page in a strong square hand saying only that he would come, and naming the packet he would come on. He had been an infant carried off his father's land in his mother's arms before the first snow, and he had never known the place, except as a wrong he could not name a thing the church people who raised him had spoken of in lowered voices, and then not at all. He came up the river on the mail packet on a gray morning in March, a broad-shouldered, sober man in a workman's coat, and he stepped off onto the strand where his father had built the boat, and stood there a moment, looking at the water as a man looks at a thing he has heard of all his life and never seen. Tabitha took him to where the skiff lay opened on its poles. She told him plainly what the boat had held and how it had held it, in few words, the way she would have wanted to be told. She put into his hands the daguerreotype of the young man and the seated woman with the parasol, the only likeness of his parents that existed in the world, and he held the little hinged case in 2 hands that were scarred and thick with the work of grading railroad beds, and he looked down at the clouded glass a long while, tilting it to catch the light off the river so the faces would come clear. He asked her quietly which one was his mother. She showed him. He nodded once and closed the case and held it against his chest. And the man who feared no labor and answered to no one stood on the riverbank and could not speak for a while either. There was a great deal of silence at that landing in those months. It was the silence of things long buried coming up into the air, and a town learning, slowly, what it had let happen, and not knowing yet how to say so. The land was returned. It took the better part of a year, and the help of a circuit judge who came twice and read the patent and the receipt and the letter and the marginal note in the packet company's book, and who looked a long time at a brass watch with a dead man's initials on the back that had been found in the bottom of a boat. The cotton planter who held the 40 acres had bought them in good faith 4 owners down the line and had to be made whole, and the land company before him, and there was a great deal of paper, and Tabitha sat through all of it in the back of the borrowed courtroom in her one good dress and said little, because she had learned that the proof speaks better than the finder of it. In the end, the patent stood, as a true patent stands against all the forged paper laid over it, and the 40 acres of bottomland came back into the name of Dell, and the son who had been carried off them as an infant walked them again as a grown man, and stood at the line of trees his father had cleared, and put his hand on the bark of an oak his father's hand had spared, and said nothing for a long while, because it ran in that family, the silence over a thing too large for words. Tabitha did not take a fee for it. She had not done it for a fee. She mended boats for the town that summer, real boats, working ones, and the town brought them to her now without a joke in it, and paid her in coin and in cordwood and in the slow regard that a place gives to a person it is decided to keep. Pell, the freight hand, built a new well housing over Effie's well one Sunday, with his own hands and his own lumber, and would not say why, and the old woman watched him do it from her step, and did not embarrass him by thanking him too much. The town did not punish itself for what it had believed, and Tabitha did not ask it to. People who have laughed at a thing do not need to be made to weep for it. They need only to be shown once plainly, and then left to find their own way to the new understanding, which they will reach in their own time, and call their own idea, and that is well enough. The dead are not served by the living tearing at each other. She kept the boat. When the land was settled and the son had gone back west to his grade camp with the daguerreotype wrapped in a clean cloth in his coat, the question of the skiff remained, the broken $2 skiff that had held the whole of it, and there was talk in the town of burning it at last, of making an end of the thing that had carried so much grief. Tabitha would not have it burned. She took the boat up the bank to the patch of ground behind the boarding house where she had set up her trade, and she did with it the thing she knew how to do, the thing her grandfather had left in her hands. She took it apart plank by plank, and she saved every board that the river had not ruined, the straight cypress that a good builder had cut and shaped and clenched together a long time gone, and she built it again. Not as a strong box this time, not with a hollow in its bottom and a secret in its keel, but as a plain, honest boat, a double-ender a man might build to run a trot line or carry a sack of corn across to the mill. Every joint of it shone and nothing hidden, because the time for hidden things at that landing was over. It took her the whole of a winter, and into the spring. She worked it the slow way, in the cold of the mornings, before the town was up, the same hour she had first split it open. And her grandfather was with her in her hands the whole of it, in the set of a clench nail and the fare of a plank and the long patience of a thing done right, because doing it right is the only honest way to do it at all. When the new boat was done, she launched it off the strand on a still morning in the spring, and it sat the water level and true, the keel, straight as the day a dead man had laid it, and it did not leak a drop. And the old wood that had been to the bottom of the river and held its secret through 11 hard years floated up clean into the new light, as if it had only been waiting all that time to be of honest use again. She rowed it across to the far bank where the church had been, where a young man had once carried his wife under a parasol like the queen of the river, and she sat in the middle of the stream a while with the oars shipped and the brown water sliding under the good cypress hull. And she was quiet there too. But it was a different quiet than the hour on the strand had been. That earlier silence had been the silence of a truth too heavy to lift. This was the silence of a thing set right and let go. She had not raised the dead, and she had not punished the man who made them dead, who was beyond all punishment now and always had been. She had only taken a thing the world had thrown away for $2, and sat with it until it told her the truth, and carried that truth up into the light where it belonged, and given a man back his name, and a son back his ground. The bell across the water struck the hour, and Tabitha took up the oars and turned the little boat for home, and the wake spread out behind her smooth and even across the river that had kept the secret so long and given it up at last to a pair of patient hands. There are things the world buries that it means to stay buried. And there are things the world buries that only wait sound and straight under the ruin, for somebody willing to kneel down in the cold and listen. The skiff carried her into the strand, and she stepped out onto the wet sand and pulled it up after her, and she ran her hand once along the gunwale, the worn cypress warm now in the sun, and then she went up the bank to her morning's work, and the river went on behind her as the river always does.